Between 1953 and 1969, the Bellamy Family Treatment Center in Charleston, West Virginia claimed to rehabilitate troubled Appalachian families. Yet of the 847 children who entered the facility, only 293 would ever return to their communities alive. The skeletal remains of the Bellamy compound still cling to the hillside above the Kanawha River, its rusted gates and crumbling foundations hidden beneath decades of mountain laurel and Virginia. Creeper. Local hunters avoid the area, claiming their dogs refuse to track game through those woods. The silence there feels different, they say, heavier, as if the mountain itself holds its breath in remembrance of what transpired within those walls. What began as Appalachia's most progressive family rehabilitation center became a charnel house where entire bloodlines were systematically destroyed under the guise of social reform and Christian redemption. The institution's reputation. The Bellamy Family Treatment Center emerged from the post-war optimism of 1953, when the federal government's renewed focus on Appalachian poverty created unprecedented opportunities for social intervention programs. Founded by Dr. William Harris and his wife, Helen Brooks Harris, the institution was conceived as a revolutionary approach to addressing what contemporary social scientists termed cultural poverty among mountain families. Unlike traditional children's homes that separated young people from their families, the Bellamy Center promised to rehabilitate entire family units, transforming what government reports characterized as dysfunctional mountain culture into productive modern American households. Dr. Harris arrived in Charleston with credentials that impressed both federal bureaucrats and local politicians. A graduate of Columbia University's School of Social Work, he had previously directed family intervention programs in rural Tennessee and Kentucky that had earned recognition from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. His doctoral dissertation, Cultural Pathology in Isolated Rural Communities, had been cited in congressional testimony supporting increased federal investment in Appalachian development. Harris's approach to family rehabilitation combined the latest theories in behavioral psychology with traditional Christian values, a synthesis that appealed to both progressive social reformers and conservative political leaders. Helen Brooks Harris brought equally impressive qualifications to the venture. The daughter of a prominent Charleston banking family, she held a master's degree in family psychology from the University of Virginia and had extensive experience working with displaced families during the war years. Her family's financial contributions to the project, combined with her social connections throughout West Virginia's political establishment, ensured that the Bellamy Center would receive both adequate funding and protective oversight from sympathetic officials. The physical facility constructed by the Harrises reflected their ambitious vision for family rehabilitation. Built on a 200-acre site that had previously housed a civilian Conservation Corps camp, the center consisted of multiple residential buildings designed to accommodate intact family units while providing space for therapeutic interventions and educational programs. The main administration building, constructed in the colonial revival style popular among federal projects of the era, housed offices, meeting rooms, and what Harris termed intensive treatment facilities for families requiring specialized intervention. Residential accommodations were arranged in a series of cottage-style buildings that could house between 4 and 6 families each. These structures were designed to simulate normal household environments while allowing staff members to monitor and guide family interactions. Each cottage included common areas for meals and recreation, individual family quarters with sleeping arrangements for parents and children, and specialized rooms where therapeutic sessions could be conducted under controlled conditions. The center's educational facilities represented one of its most innovative features. Rather than sending children to local schools, the Bellamy Center operated its own educational program that integrated traditional academic subjects with what Harris called cultural rehabilitation training. This approach allowed staff members to monitor children's progress continuously, while ensuring that educational content reinforced the behavioral modifications being implemented within family units. From its opening in September 1953, the Bellamy Center attracted families from throughout Appalachia. State social service agencies, overwhelmed by the complexity of problems facing mountain communities, eagerly referred families whose circumstances seemed to require comprehensive intervention. Federal agencies provided additional referrals through programs designed to address chronic unemployment, substance abuse, and what government reports characterized as cultural isolation among rural populations. The center's intake process was designed to identify families whose circumstances made them suitable candidates for the intensive rehabilitation program Harris had developed. Families typically arrived after being referred by social service agencies, courts, or religious organizations that had determined traditional interventions were insufficient to address their problems. The most common referrals involved families where chronic poverty, substance abuse, domestic violence, or child neglect had created conditions that threatened the welfare of children. Initial assessments conducted by the center's professional staff evaluated each family member's psychological condition, educational level, employment history, and what Harris termed cultural adaptation potential. These evaluations, documented in extensive case files that would later prove crucial to understanding the center's operations, provided the foundation for individualized treatment plans designed to address each family's specific deficiencies. The treatment philosophy implemented at Bellamy Center was based on Harris's belief that dysfunctional family patterns could be eliminated through intensive behavioral modification combined with cultural re-education. Families underwent systematic programs designed to replace what Harris characterized as primitive mountain customs with behaviors and attitudes appropriate for modern American society. This process involved intensive supervision of all family interactions, mandatory participation in educational and religious programs, and carefully controlled exposure to approved cultural influences. Harris's approach to family rehabilitation gained recognition throughout the social work profession during the center's early years. His articles in professional journals described innovative techniques for addressing multi-generational patterns of poverty and dysfunction that had previously been considered intractable. The center became a training site for social workers from universities throughout the region, while Harris himself was invited to consult on similar projects in other states. Federal oversight of the Bellamy Center was conducted through regular inspections by representatives from multiple agencies involved in funding the program. These inspections consistently praised the facility's professional standards, innovative programming, and measurable results in transforming troubled families. Reports filed with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare noted that families completing the center's program showed significant improvements in employment rates, educational achievement, and community integration when compared to control groups receiving traditional social services. The center's success in attracting federal funding allowed for continuous expansion and improvement of its facilities and programs. Additional residential buildings were constructed to accommodate growing demand, while specialized facilities were added to support new therapeutic interventions Harris developed. By 1958, the center housed nearly 300 individuals representing approximately 75 families at any given time, making it one of the largest family treatment facilities in the United States. Local political leaders embraced the Bellamy Center as evidence of West Virginia's commitment to progressive social reform. Governor Cecil Underwood frequently cited the facility in speeches promoting the state's efforts to address Appalachian poverty, while congressional representatives used the center's apparent success to argue for increased federal investment in regional development programs. The institution became a symbol of modern scientific approaches to social problems that distinguished West Virginia from neighboring states still relying on traditional welfare programs. Religious leaders throughout Appalachia praised Harris's integration of Christian principles with professional social work practices. The center's emphasis on moral rehabilitation alongside behavioral modification appealed to conservative religious communities that had previously been skeptical of government social programs. Harris frequently spoke at religious conferences and seminars, describing his methods as a practical application of Christian charity that addressed both spiritual and material needs of troubled families. The center's educational program received particular recognition from professional educators who visited the facility. The individualized instruction provided to children from participating families was tailored to address educational deficits while reinforcing behavioral modifications being implemented within family units. Standardized test results showed dramatic improvements among children who had previously struggled in traditional school settings, while high school completion rates approached 100% among older children in the program. Professional mental health practitioners also recognized Harris's innovative approach to family therapy. His techniques for addressing multi-generational trauma and dysfunctional relationship patterns were considered groundbreaking applications of emerging psychological theories. The center became a research site where graduate students and faculty from universities throughout the region conducted studies on family dynamics and intervention strategies. Financial management of the center remained exemplary throughout its early years, with regular audits confirming appropriate use of federal funds and private donations. The facility's ability to demonstrate measurable outcomes while maintaining reasonable per-family costs made it a model for efficiency in social service delivery. Harris's management of the complex funding streams supporting the center's operations earned recognition from federal administrators seeking to replicate similar programs in other regions. By 1960, the Bellamy Family Treatment Center had achieved national recognition as a pioneer in comprehensive family intervention. Harris received invitations to testify before congressional committees, considering expansion of federal social programs, while the center itself hosted visits from international delegations studying American approaches to poverty and family dysfunction. Professional journals featured articles describing the center's methods and outcomes, establishing Harris as a leading authority on family rehabilitation in isolated rural communities. The center's success generated substantial interest from other communities seeking to address similar problems among their own populations. Harris consulted on the development of comparable facilities in other Appalachian states, while his published materials provided guidance for social service agencies implementing family-based intervention programs. The Bellamy model became synonymous with effective scientific approaches to addressing complex social problems that had previously been considered beyond the reach of professional intervention. Community support for the center remained strong throughout its first decade of operation. Local business leaders recognized the economic benefits of transforming chronically unemployed families into productive community members, while religious leaders appreciated the center's emphasis on moral rehabilitation. The facility's graduates frequently became success stories cited by community leaders as evidence of the region's capacity for positive change. The professional staff assembled by Harris to implement the center's programs represented some of the most qualified practitioners in their respective fields. Dr. James Franklin, a psychiatrist with specialized training in family dynamics, served as the facility's medical director. Miss Dorothy Hughes, a graduate of Teachers College at Columbia University, directed the educational program. Mr. Robert Anderson managed the center's social work department, while Mrs. Margaret Wells supervised therapeutic programs for women and children. Each staff member brought expertise that enhanced the center's capacity to address the complex problems presented by participating families. Their collective commitment to Harris's rehabilitation philosophy created a therapeutic environment that visitors consistently described as professional, caring, and effective. The staff's dedication to the center's mission was evident in their willingness to work long hours under challenging conditions to ensure that each family received appropriate attention and support. The center's research program, conducted under Harris's direction, generated valuable data about family dysfunction and rehabilitation that influenced social policy throughout the region. Studies conducted using families participating in the center's programs provided insights into the causes and treatment of multi-generational poverty that had practical applications for other social service agencies. This research component enhanced the center's reputation while providing additional justification for continued federal funding. Ignored signs. The first disturbing observations about the Bellamy Center's operations emerged not from professional oversight mechanisms, but from the margins of Charleston's community, voices that carried little authority against the institution's sterling reputation among state and federal officials. In the spring of 1957, Mrs. Evelyn Clark, a schoolteacher whose classroom window overlooked the center's grounds, began documenting unusual activities that occurred during what should have been normal family recreation periods. Mrs. Clark's meticulous notes, maintained in a personal journal that would not surface until decades later, described scenes that contradicted the center's public image of therapeutic family interaction. She observed families standing motionless in outdoor courtyards for hours at a time, regardless of weather conditions, while staff members watched from nearby buildings. Children were frequently separated from their parents and subjected to what appeared to be punishment sessions that involved prolonged physical stress positions. Most disturbing to Mrs. Clark were the evening activities she witnessed through the center's windows, gatherings that seemed to involve systematic humiliation of family members by staff personnel. Mrs. Clark's attempts to report her observations to school district officials were dismissed as the concerns of an overly suspicious teacher who had misinterpreted legitimate therapeutic activities. When she persisted in documenting what she considered abusive treatment of families, she was warned by her principal that continued complaints might affect her employment prospects. The message was clear. Questioning the Bellamy Center's methods was not welcome, regardless of what observers might witness from outside the facility's walls. Similar dismissals greeted concerns raised by other community members, whose positions brought them into contact with center operations. Mr. Thomas Lambert, a delivery driver who regularly brought supplies to the facility, reported witnessing staff members using physical force against family members in ways that seemed excessive for any legitimate therapeutic purpose. His accounts of seeing children with obvious injuries and families displaying signs of malnutrition were disregarded by the authorities he contacted, who noted that such observations from unauthorized personnel could easily be misinterpreted. The first documented medical concerns about the center's treatment of families emerged in 1958, when Dr. Eugene Hoffman at Charleston General Hospital began noticing patterns in patients brought from the Bellamy facility. Over an 18-month period, he treated 23 individuals from the center for injuries that seemed inconsistent with the explanations provided by accompanying staff members. Broken bones attributed to recreational accidents showed fracture patterns more consistent with deliberate infliction of injury. Burns explained, as kitchen mishaps appeared too systematic and extensive to result from normal household activities. Dr. Hoffman's attempts to document these discrepancies and report them to appropriate authorities met with bureaucratic resistance that frustrated his efforts to protect vulnerable patients. His letters to the State Department of Health were acknowledged, but never resulted in investigations of the center's medical practices. When he requested meetings with department officials to discuss his concerns, he was told that the center's excellent inspection record made his suspicions seem unfounded and potentially damaging to an important state program. The pattern of families disappearing from the Bellamy Center without adequate documentation began to emerge in 1959, though the full scope of these disappearances would not become apparent until much later. The first case involved the Morrison family, parents Donald and Betty Morrison with their 3 children, ages 8, 12, and 15, who had been admitted to the center in January 1959 for treatment of what intake records described as chronic domestic instability and parental inadequacy. According to official records maintained by the center, the Morrison family completed their rehabilitation program in September 1959 and was successfully reintegrated into their home community in rural Kanawha County. However, when social workers attempted to conduct follow-up visits, as required by federal oversight protocols, they discovered that no family matching the Morrisons' description had returned to their reported address. Neighbors in the area had no knowledge of the family's whereabouts, and attempts to locate them through employment records, school enrollments, or other official documents proved unsuccessful. Dr. Harris's explanation for the Morrison family's apparent disappearance was that they had relocated to another state to pursue employment opportunities that had emerged during their rehabilitation process. He provided documentation indicating that the family had requested assistance in finding housing and employment in Ohio, where relatives could provide additional support for their transition to independent living. This explanation satisfied state officials, who noted that successful families often chose to relocate after completing treatment to avoid stigma associated with their previous problems. The Morrison case established a pattern that would be repeated dozens of times over the following years. Families who had completed the center's program would officially be discharged to return to their home communities, only to vanish without trace once they left the facility's grounds. In each case, Dr. Harris provided plausible explanations for the family's disappearances that satisfied official inquiries, while making further investigation practically impossible. Mrs. Rose Jennings, a former employee who worked as a family counselor at the center from 1960 to 1962, provided the first credible insider account of conditions that contradicted the facility's public image. After leaving her position, she attempted to report what she had witnessed to multiple authorities, including state social services, federal oversight agencies, and local law enforcement. Her detailed statements, preserved in legal files that would not surface until decades later, described systematic abuse that went far beyond legitimate therapeutic intervention. According to Mrs. Jennings' testimony, families at the Bellamy Center were subjected to treatment regimens that constituted systematic torture disguised as behavioral modification. She described witnessing children being confined in basement isolation cells for weeks at a time, fed minimal rations and denied access to basic sanitary facilities. Parents were forced to participate in degradation sessions, where they were compelled to confess to fabricated moral failures while their children watched. Families who resisted treatment protocols faced escalating punishments that included separation, physical abuse, and threats against their lives. Mrs. Jennings' most disturbing allegations concerned what she termed elimination protocols for families deemed unsuitable for rehabilitation. She claimed to have discovered evidence that families who failed to respond to treatment or who posed security risks were not discharged from the program, but were instead subjected to procedures that resulted in their deaths. Bodies were disposed of in remote areas of the center's extensive grounds, while official records indicated that these families had been successfully returned to their communities. The response to Mrs. Jennings' allegations followed patterns that had become familiar to anyone attempting to expose problems at the Bellamy Center. Official investigations were either never initiated or conducted in such a superficial manner that they served only to validate the center's denials. Mrs. Jennings herself faced immediate retaliation that included threats to her personal safety and systematic destruction of her professional reputation. Within months of making her allegations public, she found it impossible to secure employment in social services anywhere in West Virginia. The dismissal of Mrs. Jennings's testimony was facilitated by character assassination campaigns that portrayed her as a disgruntled former employee seeking attention through sensational accusations. Dr. Harris provided documentation of what he characterized as her poor performance and inappropriate conduct during her employment, including allegations that she had violated patient confidentiality and displayed emotional instability that made her unsuitable for therapeutic work. These characterizations, widely circulated among professional networks, effectively silenced Mrs. Jennings and discouraged other potential whistleblowers from coming forward. Additional evidence of problems at the Bellamy Center emerged from unexpected sources as the 1960s progressed. Federal postal inspectors investigating mail fraud in the region discovered that the center was receiving correspondence addressed to families who had supposedly completed treatment and returned to their home communities months or years earlier. When postal officials attempted to verify the whereabouts of these families to investigate the mail irregularities, they discovered that none could be located through normal channels. The postal investigation revealed that the center was systematically intercepting mail, government benefits, and other correspondence intended for former residents who had officially been discharged from the program. This pattern suggested that families who had supposedly left the facility were either still being held there under false pretenses or had died while in the program, with staff members continuing to collect their benefits and correspondence to maintain the illusion that they had been successfully rehabilitated. Federal investigators assigned to examine the mail fraud allegations found their efforts frustrated by the same bureaucratic resistance that had stymied previous attempts to investigate the center. State officials insisted that the postal irregularities resulted from administrative errors rather than criminal activity, while Dr. Harris provided explanations that portrayed the intercepted mail as part of legitimate follow-up services provided to families during their transition period. The investigation was ultimately closed without charges being filed, though the underlying discrepancies were never adequately resolved. Medical records from hospitals throughout the region, when examined systematically, revealed disturbing patterns in the treatment of individuals brought from the Bellamy Center. Emergency room visits by center residents had increased dramatically over the years, with injuries becoming progressively more severe and suspicious. Hospital staff members, when granted protection from professional retaliation, provided testimony about conversations with patients that had raised their suspicions, but which they had been powerless to act upon given the center's reputation and political connections. Dr. Carl Bennett, who served as Chief of Emergency Medicine at Charleston General Hospital during this period, began maintaining unofficial records of Bellamy Center cases after becoming convinced that systematic abuse was occurring at the facility. His private notes discovered among his papers after his death in 1983 documented patterns of injury and psychological trauma that he had been unable to address through official channels. Dr. Bennett's records indicate that he made repeated attempts to bring his concerns to the attention of hospital administrators, state officials, and law enforcement, only to be told that his evidence was insufficient to warrant action against such a respected institution. The silence surrounding the Bellamy Center was not merely the result of bureaucratic incompetence or professional courtesy among social service agencies. Evidence that emerged in later investigations suggested that Dr. Harris had cultivated relationships with key officials throughout West Virginia's political establishment that made criticism of the center professionally dangerous. State legislators, judges, federal bureaucrats, and religious leaders had all developed personal connections to Harris and his programs that made them reluctant to credit allegations against the facility. These relationships were reinforced by the substantial federal funding that the Bellamy Center generated for various state programs and local communities. The economic impact of questioning the center's operations extended far beyond the facility itself, affecting the broader network of organizations and individuals who benefited from the federal dollars flowing through Harris's programs. Challenging the center's reputation threatened not only individual careers, but also the financial stability of entire communities that had become dependent on federal social service funding. The few professionals who persisted in raising concerns about the Bellamy Center found their careers systematically undermined through mechanisms that appeared unrelated to their criticism of the facility. Transfer requests were denied, professional references became difficult to obtain, and opportunities for advancement disappeared. Grant applications were rejected, research proposals were unfunded, and professional associations found reasons to exclude persistent critics from their activities. The message was clear. Challenging the Bellamy Center's reputation was not merely futile but actively harmful to one's professional prospects throughout the region. By the mid-1960s, the accumulated weight of ignored signs and dismissed complaints had created what investigators would later characterize as a conspiracy of silence. The mechanisms that should have protected vulnerable families had been compromised by institutional prestige, personal relationships, and economic interests. The Bellamy Center continued to operate with impunity, its reputation intact despite mounting evidence of systematic abuse and possible murder of entire families who had been entrusted to its care. Horror uncovered. The systematic horror concealed within the Bellamy Center's therapeutic facade began to unravel on November 17, 1968, when 18-year-old Samuel Warren managed to escape from the facility after witnessing what he would later describe as the murder of an entire family during a treatment session. Warren's appearance at the offices of the Charleston Gazette, emaciated, bearing obvious signs of prolonged physical abuse and exhibiting symptoms of severe psychological trauma, provided investigative reporter Ralph Daniels with the first credible witness willing to speak publicly about the true nature of Dr. Harris's family rehabilitation program. Samuel's testimony, recorded over several weeks of careful interviews conducted under protection provided by the newspaper's legal team, revealed horrors that exceeded even the most pessimistic suspicions of the facility's critics. He described a systematic program of family destruction that operated behind the Bellamy Center's respectable facade, where Dr. Harris and his staff conducted what they termed social experiments, designed to test the limits of human endurance and family loyalty under extreme stress. According to Samuel's account, families admitted to the Bellamy Center were systematically broken down through techniques that combined physical torture, psychological manipulation, and deliberate destruction of family bonds. The process began with separation of family members into different sections of the facility, where they were subjected to individual assessment sessions designed to identify psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during subsequent treatment phases. Children were typically housed in dormitory-style facilities in the basement levels of the main administration building, areas that had never appeared on architectural plans or inspection reports. These underground quarters contained individual isolation cells where children could be confined for weeks at a time with minimal food and water. Samuel described spending months in solitary confinement, punctuated by sessions where he was forced to watch filmed recordings of his parents being tortured in adjacent facilities. The most shocking revelations concerned Dr. Harris's research program, which used families as subjects in experiments that bore no resemblance to legitimate therapeutic intervention. Samuel described witnessing procedures that involved systematic infliction of pain designed to test family members' willingness to betray each other to protect themselves or their relatives. Parents were forced to choose which of their children would be subjected to particular torments, while children were compelled to participate in the torture of their own parents. Harris maintained detailed documentation of these experiments, including filmed recordings of the most extreme sessions and comprehensive written records of subjects' responses to various stimuli. Samuel had managed to steal several files during his escape, including photographs and medical records, that provided overwhelming evidence of systematic torture conducted under the guise of behavioral research. The documents revealed that Harris's experiments were not isolated incidents, but part of a comprehensive research program that had been ongoing since the center's establishment. The adoption and placement program, that had been one of the center's most celebrated successes, was revealed to be a sophisticated trafficking operation that supplied children to a network of buyers throughout the United States. Families who proved unsuitable for Harris's experiments or who posed security risks had their children removed and sold to individuals who paid substantial sums for access to vulnerable victims. These transactions were facilitated through a network that included prominent businessmen, political figures, and religious leaders who used their positions to shield the operation from investigation. Samuel's account of the center's disposal methods for families who had been subjected to lethal experiments provided crucial information for investigators attempting to locate missing persons. Bodies were typically buried in unmarked graves throughout the center's extensive grounds, with locations carefully documented in Harris's private records to ensure that evidence of specific experiments could be retrieved if needed for research purposes. Some remains were disposed of through cremation facilities that Harris had constructed on the property, while others were dissolved using chemicals in laboratory equipment located in the basement levels. Ralph Daniels' initial article about Samuel's allegations appeared on December 8, 1968, and immediately generated intense controversy throughout West Virginia's political establishment. The Bellamy Center's board of directors issued statements characterizing the accusations as fabrications by a disturbed young man seeking attention and financial compensation. Dr. Harris held press conferences in which he expressed sympathy for Samuel's obvious mental illness, while categorically denying all allegations and challenging anyone to produce credible evidence supporting such outrageous claims. The official response to Samuel's accusations followed predictable patterns of character assassination and evidence suppression. State police announced that they would investigate the allegations but immediately began focusing on discrediting Samuel's testimony rather than examining the documentary evidence he had provided. Detectives interviewed former teachers, social workers, and other professionals who had worked with Samuel, seeking information that could be used to portray him as unreliable and vindictive. However, Samuel's courage in speaking publicly had broken the psychological barrier that had prevented other survivors from coming forward with their own testimonies. Within weeks of Daniels' initial article, the Charleston Gazette was contacted by dozens of former residents and staff members who had been waiting for someone with credibility to break the silence surrounding the center's operations. The newspaper was inundated with letters, phone calls, and personal visits from individuals who provided corroborating evidence of systematic abuse and murder. Among the most compelling testimonies was that of Mrs. Alice Norton, who had worked as a nurse at the center from 1963 to 1966. Norton, now living in Ohio under an assumed name, provided detailed corroboration of Samuel's account from the perspective of a medical professional who had been forced to participate in Harris's experiments. Her testimony was particularly valuable because she could describe the medical procedures used in the torture sessions and provide professional assessments of the physical and psychological damage inflicted on victims. Norton's nursing credentials and her ability to provide specific medical details that corroborated Samuel's testimony lent credibility to the allegations that the center's defenders found difficult to dismiss. Her detailed knowledge of the facility's hidden medical facilities, combined with her willingness to testify under oath about specific incidents she had witnessed, created compelling evidence of systematic medical abuse conducted under Harris's direction. The documentary evidence continued to accumulate as the investigation expanded beyond individual testimonies. Financial records subpoenaed from banks throughout the region revealed patterns of cash transactions that were inconsistent with normal institutional operations. Large deposits were made to accounts controlled by Harris and his associates without corresponding documentation in the center's official financial reports. Similarly, payments to individuals and organizations not associated with legitimate social service activities suggested the existence of a shadow economy surrounding the center's operations. Federal investigators who had previously dismissed allegations against the center were forced to acknowledge the overwhelming accumulation of evidence pointing to systematic criminal activity. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare initiated a comprehensive review of the center's operations, while the Federal Bureau of Investigation began examining connections between the facility and interstate trafficking networks that had been operating throughout Appalachia. The breakthrough that transformed scattered allegations into criminal charges came when investigators gained access to Dr. Harris's private research facility, located in a separate building that had never appeared on official facility plans. A search warrant executed on December 20, 1968, revealed extensive documentation of experiments conducted on hundreds of families over a period of 15 years. Harris had meticulously maintained records of every procedure, including detailed notes about subjects' responses, photographic documentation, and follow-up observations of long-term effects. The research facility contained equipment that had no legitimate therapeutic purpose, including restraint devices, torture implements, and recording equipment used to document victims' suffering. Chemical supplies found on the premises included substances commonly used for disposal of human remains, while furnaces in the basement had been modified for cremation purposes. Most damning were the hundreds of personal effects, clothing, jewelry, identification documents, belonging to families who had supposedly been successfully rehabilitated and returned to their communities. Among Harris's research files, investigators discovered correspondence with officials at universities and government agencies that suggested connections to broader programs of human experimentation. Letters from researchers at various institutions discussed the potential applications of Harris's work and referenced funding sources that had never appeared in the center's official budgets. The correspondence revealed that Harris's activities were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger network of unethical research involving vulnerable populations throughout the United States. The scope of criminal activity at the Bellamy Center extended far beyond the medical experiments and family murders that had initially shocked investigators. Financial investigations revealed that the facility had been used as a front for money laundering operations involving drug trafficking, illegal weapons sales, and other criminal enterprises. The center's reputation and federal funding had made it an ideal vehicle for legitimizing proceeds from various illegal activities, with families serving as both victims and unwitting accessories to these operations. Medical examinations of the center's grounds, conducted using advanced forensic techniques, revealed evidence of systematic disposal of human remains throughout the property. Ground-penetrating radar identified numerous burial sites containing remains of multiple individuals, while soil analysis revealed chemical traces consistent with body disposal operations. The full scope of the killing that had occurred at the center began to emerge as investigators realized that hundreds of families had been murdered over a 15-year period. As evidence mounted, the conspiracy of silence that had protected the Bellamy Center began to crumble under the weight of documented criminal activity. Officials who had previously dismissed allegations were forced to acknowledge their failures to protect vulnerable families, while law enforcement agencies faced criticism for their refusal to investigate credible complaints. The center's political supporters found themselves under investigation for their roles in enabling the systematic abuse and murder of innocent families. The human cost of the crimes committed at the Bellamy Center became clear as more survivors emerged from hiding to testify about their experiences. Medical examinations of former residents revealed evidence of systematic physical and psychological abuse that had left permanent damage. Many survivors described ongoing health problems, difficulty forming relationships, and persistent psychological trauma that could be traced directly to their experiences at the facility. By early 1969, criminal charges had been filed against Dr. Harris, his wife Helen, and more than 20 staff members who had participated in the center's operations. The charges included multiple counts of murder, child abuse, human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. Additional investigations were launched into the network of individuals and organizations that had facilitated the center's criminal operations, revealing connections to corruption networks that extended throughout West Virginia's political establishment and beyond. The full scope of the conspiracy was still being uncovered when the trials began, but it was already clear that the Bellamy Center represented one of the most extensive cases of institutional mass murder in American history. The systematic destruction of entire families over more than a decade had been facilitated by a network of complicit officials, enabling professionals and corrupt institutions that had prioritized political and economic interests over the safety of vulnerable populations entrusted to their care. Legacy and silence. The criminal proceedings that followed the exposure of the Bellamy Center's systematic family extermination should have resulted in comprehensive justice for the hundreds of victims who perished within its walls. Instead, the trials became a demonstration of how institutional power, political connections, and bureaucratic self-preservation could subvert justice even in the face of overwhelming evidence of mass murder. By the time the final verdicts were delivered in 1972, the full truth about the scope of Harris's crimes had been buried beneath layers of plea bargains, sealed records, and convenient deaths that eliminated key witnesses and evidence. Dr. William Harris never faced trial for the murders of entire families under his care. On January 15, 1970, just 3 weeks before jury selection was scheduled to begin, Harris was found dead in his cell at the Kanawha County Jail. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by drug overdose, though the circumstances surrounding his death raised numerous questions that were never adequately investigated. The medication that allegedly caused his death was not prescribed to Harris and should not have been accessible within the jail facility. Additionally, Harris had shown no previous signs of suicidal ideation and had been actively preparing his defense with apparent confidence in his eventual vindication. The timing of Harris's death was particularly suspicious, given that he had recently indicated to his attorneys that he was prepared to provide information about other individuals and institutions involved in the center's operations in exchange for reduced charges. His death eliminated the possibility of revealing the full extent of the criminal network that had enabled the systematic murder of families over more than a decade, protecting numerous individuals whose involvement might otherwise have been exposed during trial proceedings. Helen Brooks Harris's trial, which began in May 1970, was systematically undermined by the disappearance of crucial evidence and the elimination of key witnesses. The extensive documentation of the center's operations that had been seized during initial raids mysteriously vanished from supposedly secure evidence storage facilities. Court officials claimed that a series of clerical errors and storage problems had resulted in the accidental destruction of thousands of documents, photographs, and recorded testimonies that formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. The trial proceeded through a series of legal challenges that effectively dismantled the prosecution's ability to demonstrate the full scope of the crimes committed at the center. Defense attorneys successfully argued that many of the alleged murders could not be proven without the missing documentary evidence, while surviving testimonies were challenged as unreliable due to the traumatic circumstances under which they had been obtained. Most damaging to the prosecution was the systematic elimination of witnesses who had provided the most compelling evidence of systematic family murder. Samuel Warren, whose initial testimony had broken the silence surrounding the center's operations, was found dead in his apartment 3 months before Helen Harris's trial was scheduled to begin. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drug overdose, though Warren had no known history of substance abuse and had been under protective custody due to threats against his life. Similarly, Alice Norton, the former nurse whose medical testimony had provided crucial corroboration of the torture sessions, died in a car accident that occurred under circumstances that raised questions about whether her death was accidental. The pattern of witness elimination continued throughout the pre-trial period, with 5 additional former residents and staff members dying under suspicious circumstances before they could testify. In each case, official investigations concluded that the deaths were either accidental or resulted from natural causes, though the statistical probability of so many key witnesses dying within such a compressed time frame suggested systematic elimination of individuals who posed threats to the remaining conspirators. Helen Harris's conviction on reduced charges of child endangerment and fraud resulted in a sentence of 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 6 years. The judge, citing her previously unblemished reputation and her cooperation with investigators, characterized her crimes as the result of misguided loyalty to her husband rather than active participation in systematic murder. Helen Harris ultimately served only 4 years before being released on parole, after which she relocated to Europe and lived comfortably until her death in 1998. The fate of other staff members at the Bellamy Center followed similar patterns of minimal accountability and maximum protection for those who agreed to remain silent about the full scope of the center's operations. Dr. James Franklin, who had served as the facility's medical director and had personally conducted many of the lethal experiments, negotiated a plea agreement that allowed him to avoid murder charges in exchange for testimony against other defendants. His sentence of 8 years for manslaughter was reduced to 3 years with time served, and he was subsequently relocated under a new identity to practice medicine in another state. Robert Anderson, who had managed the center's social work department and had been responsible for selecting families for elimination, received immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation with investigators. However, his testimony proved largely useless, as most of the documentary evidence supporting his claims had already been destroyed or had disappeared from evidence storage. Anderson's immunity agreement included provisions that prevented him from being questioned about specific aspects of the center's operations, effectively protecting information that might have implicated other individuals or institutions. The civil lawsuits filed by survivors and families of victims faced even greater obstacles than the criminal proceedings. Legal challenges to the survivors standing to sue, combined with arguments about statutes of limitations and governmental immunity, resulted in years of costly litigation that yielded minimal compensation for the victims. The state of West Virginia claimed that it could not be held liable for the actions of contractors operating federally funded programs, while federal agencies argued that oversight responsibilities belonged to state authorities. Many survivors, already traumatized by their experiences at the Bellamy Center and further damaged by the systematic elimination of witnesses, found the legal process itself to be re-traumatizing and abandoned their claims rather than endure additional abuse by a system that had already failed to protect them. The few who persisted in pursuing civil remedies faced teams of government attorneys who employed every available legal strategy to delay proceedings and exhaust plaintiffs' resources. The settlements that were eventually reached included strict confidentiality agreements that prevented survivors from speaking publicly about their experiences or the terms of their compensation. These agreements, while providing some financial relief to victims, effectively silenced the very people whose testimony might have revealed the full scope of the conspiracy surrounding the Bellamy Center. The legal system that should have provided justice instead became another mechanism for suppressing the truth and protecting those who had enabled the systematic murder of entire families. Margaret Wells, Dr. Harris's sister-in-law, who had served as the center's financial administrator and had managed the trafficking operations, never faced criminal charges despite extensive evidence of her involvement in the facility's operations. Using her family's substantial political connections and financial resources, she negotiated a settlement with federal investigators that allowed her to forfeit assets allegedly connected to criminal activities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The agreement required no admission of guilt and included provisions that sealed the records of the negotiation permanently. The physical evidence of crimes committed at the Bellamy Center was systematically destroyed in the years following the initial investigations. The underground facilities where much of the torture and murder had occurred were filled with concrete and sealed, officially for safety reasons, but effectively eliminating any possibility of future forensic investigation. The main buildings of the center were demolished in 1973, with the debris buried on site to prevent any potential recovery of evidence that might have survived the initial evidence destruction. The extensive grounds where hundreds of families had been buried were sold to a mining company that conducted strip mining operations across the entire property. The mining activities, which began in 1974, effectively obliterated any remaining evidence of the mass graves that had been identified during the initial forensic investigations. The company, which had connections to several individuals who had been involved in the center's operations, claimed that the mining was economically necessary and that the disturbance of burial sites was an unavoidable consequence of legitimate business operations. The documentary evidence that had not already disappeared was transferred to federal archives under classification restrictions that made it inaccessible to researchers, journalists, or family members seeking information about their murdered relatives. Files were classified under national security provisions that had no apparent connection to the center's operations, while access procedures were designed to be so cumbersome that few individuals had the resources to pursue them successfully. The survivors of the Bellamy Center found themselves largely abandoned by the agencies and institutions that had supposedly vindicated their suffering. Many struggled with ongoing psychological and physical health problems that stemmed from their experiences, but they received little support for treatment or rehabilitation. The social service agencies that had failed to protect them as children showed no interest in providing assistance as adults, and the mental health services available at the time were inadequate to address the complex trauma they had experienced. The systematic elimination of survivors continued in the years following the trials, though the methods became more subtle and the official explanations more plausible. Survivors died in accidents, from sudden illnesses, or from apparent suicides at rates that far exceeded statistical norms for their age groups. By 1980, fewer than a dozen of the estimated 50 survivors who had initially come forward were still alive, and most of those had been driven into hiding by persistent threats and harassment. Those survivors who remained alive found that their attempts to speak publicly about their experiences were met with systematic discrediting campaigns that portrayed them as mentally unstable individuals seeking attention or financial gain. Media outlets that had initially covered the story with interest became reluctant to publish additional information about the center's operations, citing concerns about the reliability of sources and the potential for legal liability. The broader network of individuals and institutions that had enabled the Bellamy Center's operations remained largely untouched by the investigations and prosecutions. Federal agencies that had provided funding and oversight for the center's programs conducted internal reviews that resulted in minor policy changes but no acknowledgement of institutional failures that had enabled systematic murder. State officials who had ignored warning signs or actively suppressed investigations faced no meaningful consequences for their negligence or complicity. Religious organizations that had provided legitimacy and referrals for the center's programs maintained their silence about their roles in facilitating the systematic destruction of families. Several prominent religious leaders who had served on the center's advisory board and had actively promoted its programs continued their careers without acknowledging their connections to the facility or their failures to recognize obvious signs of abuse. Academic institutions that had used the center as a research site and training facility for social work and medical students conducted no systematic reviews of the ethical implications of their involvement. Universities that had received federal funding for research conducted using the center's victims as subjects made no efforts to identify or compensate the families who had been harmed by these studies. The city of Charleston and the state of West Virginia seemed eager to erase any memory of the Bellamy Center's existence. Official histories of the region's social services omitted any mention of the facility, while promotional materials emphasized the area's progress in addressing social problems without acknowledging the systematic murder that had occurred within the state's borders. Tourist information and historical markers carefully avoided any reference to the center or its victims. Local newspapers, which had initially provided extensive coverage of the investigations and trials, gradually reduced their reporting on the story until it disappeared entirely from public discourse. Editors cited reader fatigue with the story and concerns about the continued legal proceedings, but the effect was to eliminate ongoing public awareness of the crimes and their aftermath. Within a decade, many Charleston residents had no knowledge of what had transpired at the Bellamy Center. The federal agencies that had funded and overseen the center's operations implemented policy changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future, but these reforms were largely cosmetic and did little to address the fundamental problems that had enabled the systematic murder of families. Oversight mechanisms remained inadequate, while the political and economic incentives that had motivated officials to ignore warning signs continued to operate unchanged. Professional organizations in social work, medicine, and related fields conducted no systematic reviews of the ethical failures that had enabled the center's operations for more than a decade. Licensing boards made no efforts to identify other professionals who might have been involved in similar activities, while professional journals published no analyses of the institutional factors that had facilitated systematic abuse and murder under the guise of therapeutic intervention. Today, the site where the Bellamy Center once stood is an abandoned strip mine, its scarred landscape offering no hint of the horrors that once occurred there. The mining company that destroyed the evidence of mass graves abandoned the site in the 1980s, when coal deposits were exhausted, leaving behind a moonscape of exposed rock and poisoned water that serves as an unintentional monument to the destruction of human life that occurred there. No memorial marks the location where hundreds of families suffered and died, and no historical marker acknowledges their pain or the system's failure to protect them. The few surviving relatives of victims have been unable to locate or properly bury their murdered family members, leaving them to grieve without closure or recognition of their losses. The handful of survivors still alive are now elderly, their voices growing weaker as the years pass, and their memories becoming increasingly difficult to verify due to the systematic destruction of evidence. Many have never spoken publicly about their experiences, carrying their trauma in silence as they have been forced to do for decades. The promise of justice that seemed possible in 1968 was revealed to be an illusion, another betrayal by the same system that had failed to protect them as children. The legacy of the Bellamy Center extends far beyond the individual victims who survived its horrors or the families who were murdered within its walls. The case demonstrated how institutional prestige, federal funding, and political connections could combine to shield even the most heinous crimes from accountability. It revealed the inadequacy of oversight systems supposedly designed to protect vulnerable populations, and the ease with which those systems could be corrupted or circumvented by those with sufficient power and resources. Most troubling of all, the case showed how completely the truth could be buried when those in authority had sufficient motivation to prevent its emergence. The systematic destruction of evidence, elimination of witnesses, and suppression of information created a model for institutional cover-ups that would be replicated in other cases throughout the following decades. The silence that now surrounds the Bellamy Center is not merely the absence of memory. It is an active conspiracy of forgetting maintained by institutions and individuals who benefit from keeping the past buried. The families who suffered and died within its walls have been erased from history as completely as the building itself, their pain dismissed as inconvenient, and their stories deemed unworthy of preservation. In this silence, we find the true horror of the Bellamy Center, not just what was done to vulnerable families, but how completely society has chosen to abandon them, even in death. The systematic murder of hundreds of innocent people has been transformed into a non-event, relegated to the realm of conspiracy theories and urban legends that can be safely dismissed by those who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The few documents that survived the systematic evidence destruction remain sealed in government archives, classified under provisions that will keep them hidden until all potential witnesses and survivors are dead. The truth about what happened at the Bellamy Center will likely remain buried forever, another victory for those who believe that power and privilege should protect the guilty while abandoning the innocent to forgotten graves in the Appalachian hills.